In September 1945, beneath the late summer sun, the flat stretches of Nebraska farmland shimmered as 32 Japanese prisoners of war stepped down from a U.S. military transport near the town of Scottsbluff. They had crossed half the globe from the Pacific Islands, where they were captured, into the American heartland. What they expected were labor camps, harsh discipline, perhaps something far worse. What they encountered instead would dismantle everything they believed about their enemy. This is the story of how an ordinary farming machine became the spark for one of the most profound ideological shifts of the war, and how the men who witnessed it carried that revelation back to a defeated nation, reshaping their lives forever. Lieutenant Teishi Yamamoto stood rigid as American guards unlocked the chains from his wrists. At 26 years old, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, he had until 3 months earlier held an unshakable belief in the superiority of the Japanese spirit over what he saw as American material excess. He had been taught that Americans were weak, dependent on machines because they lacked discipline and courage, and that propaganda films showing abundance were nothing more than illusions, images of indulgent, lazy people who would collapse under determined resistance. His capture had already unsettled those beliefs. The steady food, medical care, and supplies he encountered felt unreal, but Yamamoto assumed it was a temporary display, their facade designed for propaganda. Japan's military leadership had repeatedly assured its soldiers that America's industrial strength was exaggerated, that photographs of factories and production lines were Hollywood fabrications meant to demoralize Japanese forces rather than reflect reality. Sergeant First Class Robert Henderson, the son of an Iowa farmer, had overseen prisoner labor details for nearly 18 months. He expected resentment, maybe hatred, especially since his younger brother had been stationed at Pearl Harbor. Instead, the prisoners arriving in Nebraska were gaunt, exhausted, and visibly disoriented. Following orders from Colonel William Fitzgerald, they were treated according to the Geneva Conventions, given adequate food, proper housing, and work that supported the local community, while American farmhands remained overseas. More than that, they were deliberately shown every day American life, an experiment in psychological warfare rooted not in fear, but in exposure to reality. Dispatched to farms throughout the region, the prisoners helped relieve a severe labor shortage during the wheat harvest. Private Hiroshi Tanaka, once a fisherman, stood among fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, stunned by the sheer abundance of food. Farmers like Ernest Schultz laid out clear expectations, fair meals and wages, without beatings, threats, or impossible quotas. Slowly, Tanaka understood that this world bore little resemblance to what he had been taught. Lieutenant Yamamoto, assigned to the Peterson family farm, encountered the same treatment, but the moment that altered everything came in early October. When James Peterson arrived towing a massive machine Yamamoto had never seen before, a combine harvester. Peterson explained that it cut, threshed, and cleaned wheat in a single continuous process, replacing the labor of dozens of men in a fraction of the time. Yamamoto initially assumed it was a war machine disguised as agricultural equipment. Corporal Kenji Sato, an engineering student, studied it more closely as Peterson described its gasoline, engine, and interconnected systems capable of harvesting more than 40 acres a day. When Peterson casually mentioned that it was a standard 1941 model, widely used years before the war, the implications landed with crushing force. This was not advanced military technology. It was ordinary American farming, as the combine roared across the field, consuming in minutes what would have taken the prisoners an entire day. Yamamoto understood that everything he had believed about American industrial capacity was fundamentally wrong. That night, back at camp, officers spoke in quiet, urgent tones. Captain Ichiro Nakamura, once a professor of political economy, articulated what they all now grasped. A nation capable of producing such machines in such numbers for agriculture alone possessed a military production capacity far beyond anything Japan's leadership had acknowledged. The assessments they had been given were not optimistic, they were fiction. Yamamoto wrote carefully in his notebook, aware that his understanding of the War of America and of the world itself had shifted irrevocably. Yamamoto carefully wrote down everything he could recall from the Peterson farm. The combine's technical details, the casual way Peterson spoke about production figures, and the fact that the machine, already 4 years old, operated flawlessly. It suggested not only immense production capacity, but something even more unsettling: sustained maintenance, spare parts and systems designed to endure. In the weeks that followed, the prisoners began to observe their surroundings differently. Trucks arrived regularly to supply the camp, varied models, different manufacturers, all operating reliably. They noticed the guards' watches, distinct in design and make, implying mass production even of small consumer goods. They paid attention to the paved roads, the electric lines running directly to isolated farms, and telephone wires connecting rural communities valleys to distant cities. What once blended into the background now formed a pattern that could not be ignored. On the Schultz farm, Private Hiroshi Tanaka encountered another quiet revelation: replacement tractor parts, ordered through a mail catalog, arrived in just 3 days, shipped from a warehouse hundreds of miles away. With his military background, Tanaka immediately understood the significance. Civilian farmers could receive critical mechanical components faster than Japanese forces could resupply frontline units scattered across remote islands. The implications were impossible to rationalize away. Back at the camp, the interpreter, George Takahashi, an American of Japanese descent, who had initially been met with suspicion, slowly became a source of insight. As the prisoners began asking questions, Takahashi explained that hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans lived across the United States. Some had been relocated to internment camps early in the war under a policy that remained controversial and widely opposed. Others continued operating businesses, attending schools, and living ordinary lives. Takahashi spoke of his own family: parents who had immigrated decades earlier, a father who owned a small grocery store, and 2 brothers currently serving in the U.S. military in Europe. This directly contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught about race, loyalty, and social hierarchy. Takahashi explained that American citizenship rested on shared political ideals rather than ethnicity, an idea that challenged their deepest assumptions about identity and belonging. As winter approached, the prisoners helped with the corn harvest and encountered yet another machine, the corn picker. Its efficiency reinforced a growing realization this was an engineering culture relentlessly focused on innovation and practical outcomes. Later, Peterson invited several prisoners, including Yamamoto, to share lunch with his family. The sheer abundance of food, especially meat, struck Yamamoto not as excess but as routine. Even amid a global war, American civilians ate better than Japanese officers had during peacetime. During that meal, Peterson spoke quietly about his son Michael, killed at Guadalcanal. His wife Margaret expressed grief without hatred, condemning the war itself rather than the men forced to fight it. The absence of bitterness left a deeper impression than anger ever could. By December, after 3 months in Nebraska, the camp population had grown into the hundreds. Stories of the combine harvester circulated among the prisoners, fueling longer conversations and deeper reflection. Guards noticed subtle changes. Rigid formality softened, curiosity replaced suspicion, and requests for English lessons and newspapers increased. The camp commander encouraged this shift, believing that education achieved what coercion never could. Despite the brutal winter, the barracks remained heated, clothing was issued, and food stayed sufficient, further sharpening the contrast with conditions many had endured within the imperial military. In letters written during this time, though not sent until after the war, Tanaka described the surreal experience of being better fed as a prisoner than he had been as a soldier. When news of Japan's surrender and the atomic bombings reached the camp, reactions varied. Some dismissed it as propaganda. Others, including Yamamoto, recognized the pattern. The combine harvester had been the first fracture in their ideological certainty. Everything that followed only widened the crack. In the spring of 1946, as preparations for repatriation began, Schultz shared his beliefs with Tanaka. Farming, he said, taught immutable truths. You could not harvest what you did not plant, and willpower alone could never overcome material reality. Courage without wisdom was waste. Had Japanese leaders seen American farms and factories firsthand, Schultz believed war would never have been chosen. When Tanaka asked why this capacity had not been demonstrated earlier to prevent conflict, Schultz replied simply that some truths were only accepted after consequences were felt. Before returning to Japan, Yamamoto visited Peterson one final time and asked what message he should carry home. Peterson answered that Americans were not superhuman, only people who built systems that worked, valued practical results over ideology, and used tools to improve life rather than dominate others. The combine, he said, was not a weapon, but proof of what human ingenuity could accomplish when directed toward creation. Yamamoto bowed. Peterson extended his hand. They shook, not as enemies but as equals. After repatriation, the former prisoners carried these lessons with them. Decades later, Yamamoto returned to Nebraska and stood before the old combine harvester, now silent, remembering the moment it dismantled his worldview. The machine itself had never been kind or cruel. It was simply a tool, governed by universal principles, yet it accomplished what propaganda never could. It forced a confrontation with reality. For those who witnessed it, the combine harvester became a symbol of productive civilization, a reminder that true true national strength lies not only in the power to destroy, but in the ability to create, sustain, and improve human life. The most effective challenges to dangerous ideologies don't come from arguments or force, but from simple demonstrations of alternative possibilities. Showing people what life could be is more powerful than telling them what to think. Technology devoted to improving human welfare creates deeper, more lasting change than technology designed to dominate others. And that brings our story to an end.